Okay, so my name is Jason Morgan. I'm the environmental coordinator here for the Department of Public Works for the city of Greenbelt. For those of you who care about credentials, I have a master's degree in biology with a focus on ecology. My master's work was done with termites, but my undergraduate work was done with bees, native bees in particular. So this is not beekeeping for honeybees. It's not, apiary. I'm not an apiologist, and so I got really into native bees as an undergrad, volunteering at the USGS Native Bee Monitoring Laboratory with Sam Droege. And I volunteered in his lab for about 2 years, catching, processing, and identifying bees in counties that had really low counts. So I went through the database that he had, and any county that essentially had 10 species or less in Maryland, I would then go to those during the summer and catch bees using traps and nets and all kinds of different things. I'd process them, I'd ID them the best I could. I could usually get to genus pretty well, and then he would take over and have to do it to species to beef up those record numbers so we know what bees are where. So I have a few first county records on the book, but other than that, that's been a few years now. So there have been other people who have taken over that volunteer position and have beefed up the numbers considerably, but he still gives me an update every couple of years whenever I ask for the updates. His spreadsheet, it just keeps growing and growing. So our knowledge of these bees is increasing as far as their distribution in the state of Maryland, especially with his lab focusing on it. So if you really want to know who the bee guru is around here, it's Sam Droege at the USGS Native Bee Monitoring Laboratory. Reach out to that guy. He's super busy, but he's also very nice and very helpful and more than willing to talk about bees as the day is long. All right. So with that being said, that's a long way of me saying that I am not an expert, but I do appreciate them. I've read up on them quite a bit, and so there's a lot of questions that you might have that I will be able to answer, and a lot of them that I probably won't. Yes?
He has a Facebook page just called Bees.
Does he?
And you can public access any of his bee photos like that.
Yeah, I got these pictures from his Flickr account. So I have pictures that are very detailed like this, that if you really like them, go to Sam Droege's Flickr account, just Google it.
Spell his last name.
Droege.
Yes, Droege. Yes, thank you. And, oh, hey, look, there's a fly. It's jealous. I'm not giving a presentation on flies, sorry, not today. So without further ado, I guess we can move on. So just basic numbers, there's like 20,000 species of bee around the world and counting. I mean, new ones are discovered every year. About 4,000 in the US, that includes Canada and Mexico. And then like 400 and counting in Maryland, and then even in Prince George's County where we are now, there's 200. I think it's up to more like 250 now. But I couldn't find the exact number, so I just went conservative estimates here. And so most of your bees, about 70-30 split, less than 1% nest like honeybees do, and bumblebees in an actual nest that have many members and they're all cooperating and all that. But about 70% will nest underground. The houses that we'll make later on, that's not for them. They will just nest straight in the soil. They dig in the soil, they'll make their nest in there on their own. But cavity nesting bees, this 30% here, you'll most likely attract some of those. They make nest in pre-existing cavities. And the first bees evolved a long time ago, and it got out too far away. But social bees pop up about 50 million years later. So evolutionarily speaking, 50 million years, not that long of a time. So social bees came around fairly quickly. And all of this starts to happen right around the time flowering plants start to diversify. So bees and flowers have really been working together and diversifying and evolving together since pretty much day one. So what's a bee? Bees are insects, in case you didn't know. I'll go over what classifies as an insect here in a little bit. They belong to the order Hymenoptera, which include your ants and your wasps. So that's why ants, bees, and wasps look kind of similar. They all have very pinched waist. Ants do have reproductive flying members of their colony, so they all have wings at one point in their lives. And a lot of them will be social. Like you have ant colonies, you have honeybee colonies, you have wasp colonies. Think of hornets and yellow jackets, paper wasps. And so to span the whole spectrum of sociality, I'll cover that here in a little bit. But the thing, bees evolved from cephid wasps. There's a picture of one right down there. And cephid wasps are really primitive wasps. The adults Depending on the species, some of them will feed on nectar, and that's true for a lot of wasps. The adults will feed on nectar to get energy, but then they will kill other insects and then feed those to their young. So they're developing larvae. They'll either kill an entire insect and put it in underground and lay an egg on it, and the larvae will eat that insect, or the adult will chew up the insect and then regurgitate it to living young in a colony somewhere. It just depends on the species. Bees, on the other hand, totally rely on flowers for everything. Their young eat pollen. Some bees will eat pollen, but all the adult bees will also eat or drink nectar for energy to keep them going. With the exception of species in the Trigona genus down in South America, they're known as the stingless honeybee. They make a totally different honey than the European honeybee, but they're very famous down there. If you ever get a chance to try the honey from a stingless honeybee in South America, I would recommend it. It's very, very different. I didn't care for it very much. It has a very distinct, almost like vinegary flavor to it, and that's because it ferments, because it's so hot down there, and they don't actively cool their nest enough to keep the temperature in check. So that's why honey is real sweet. And the stingless honeybee in South America, their honey is a little more fermenty tasting, so it's very, very
alcoholic?
I don't know. I don't recall getting any kind of intoxication after eating it, but I didn't have very much because, again, I didn't really care for it very much. But it was an interesting flavor. But they actually, some species in that group of bees will, or at least one species will actually feed their young chewed up insects. Or some kind of insect flesh. So they're an exception. So in biology, there's these rules, right? But you're always going to find an exception if you look hard enough. Yes.
You mentioned European honeybees. Are all the honeybees here imported from Europe then? Or are there native ones to North America?
No, there are no native honeybees to North America. They're all imported from, so there's different species of honeybee. There's like Russian honeybees and Italian honeybees and European honeybees. And so they're all different species. You have African honeybees. But the majority of the bees that beekeepers are using are the European honeybee, Apis mellifera. And so they are imported from Europe, yes. So this is a little diagram of a honeybee, but it's going to have the same parts as other bees. So this is a very easy diagram to go with. So I said they're insects. Insects have 3 body parts, a head, a thorax, and an abdomen. They have 6 legs. 3 are shown here. Pretend there's 3 on the other side.
Sorry.
They have antennae. That's how an insect basically navigates its world. It's like the nose of the insect. Picks up scents and pheromones and things. Bees have 4 wings. 4-wing and a hind wing. In flight, they link together with microscopic hooks to become one unit, and then they separate so they can fold when they're not in flight. Flies will only have 2 wings. So that's an easy way to tell a fly from a bee. 2 wings for flies, 4 wings for bees. Of course, wasps have 4 wings, and then ants, if they're in flight reproductive, known as an alate, they will also have 4 wings. These spiracles here, those are used for breathing. So insects have a passive breathing system. They don't inhale and exhale like we do. They just open these little holes, and the air passively exchanges. Oxygen-rich air from outside goes in and displaces the carbon dioxide-rich air inside their bodies. So they have these tubes that go all throughout their bodies, and they all open up with these little spiracles. This is why the 1950s sci-fi giant insects cannot exist, because an insect that large would have to have some kind of active breathing to force fresh air into their system so that they can live. Passive respiration like this keeps you very small because air has to travel in and out, and so if you have too much surface area, it can't penetrate and get to all of your cells and keep you going, can't metabolize and things like that. So this is why insects are small, and they will never be really, really large. Now, in the fossil record, there are very, very large insects because the oxygen concentration in the atmosphere back then was much higher. But then again, they were never as big as the giant ants from 1950s sci-fi's destroying cities, right? This has a stinger on the diagram there. Honeybees have a stinger. In everything else, it's an ovipositor. It's an egg-laying apparatus. That's where the egg comes from. You'll have giant inchimum wasps that have ovipositors that are this big, and people are like, "That's a giant stinger! Get away from me!" That is its egg-laying apparatus, and what they'll do is they'll maneuver that into dead wood to find a beetle larvae to lay their egg into, and that's why it's real long, so they can wiggle it through dead wood. Bees and wasps and even some ants, that ovipositor, because they have members who are not laying eggs, so they have workers if they're a social colony, has modified that to be a stinger. So in ants, they'll go out and use that stinger to kill an insect or stun an insect to bring back to the nest to provision for the rest of the colony. Honeybees use it in defense of the colony. Wasps, they'll use it to kill insects and in defense of the colony. So your solitary bees, the ones that are not social, they do not have a stinger, because you cannot have a stinger and an ovipositor. It's got to be one or the other. So if you have a stinger, you cannot lay eggs. So if you can't lay eggs, you cannot make more of you, which means that there's no genetics being passed along to code for a stinger. The stinger is an ovipositor in your stingless bees, which cannot sting. Some people say, well, I've been stung by a sweat bee. You're being bit by a sweat bee. Two very different things. It still hurts, sure, but it's not being, you're not being stung, you're being bit. So honeybees and bumblebees, because they both form colonies, their workers will have stingers because their queen has an ovipositor, which allows her to lay the eggs. Yes.
Our office is across the street,
Mm-hmm.
and yesterday there was flying ants,
Mm-hmm.
and people said the ants are landing on them and stinging them. So were they really biting them?
Either they were just freaking out and nothing was happening,
She had big bumps
or
on
they
her.
were
No,
biting.
I had the same thing. I was hanging laundry out the other day, and there were just these small winged ants,
Mhm.
and they were all of my legs.
Yeah. I would imagine they're
But
probably
it felt
biting.
like they were biting.
Mhm.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't
Yeah.
think they were stinging. I mean, I thought they were
That's what you
biting.
just said. They were
Those are going to be
Um,
males and females that are finding each other to mate
Oh.
and then start a new colony. So the males are not going to have a stinger at all.
They seem to be busy, right?
Yeah.
Probably in the grass where I was,
Well,
you
they
know.
like humans.
Because
And
they
then,
just seem
You're
to
in
be
the
in
way
that
of their
one
party.
area.
Yeah.
That's what I
They might be
assumed.
wanting to make a nest there, who knows.
Yeah.
But the females who are winged, they have to have an ovipositor to lay eggs. They
Right.
can't have a stinger, so they're not stinging.
That's good news.
One thing with the bees, they have these ocelli, which are these light receptor organs on the top of the head, because bees, they're active during the day. They use the sun for navigation. And so that helps them navigate with the sun, is these light receptor ocelli. Your wasp and your ants will also have that. That is why they're all active during the daytime.
All hymenopters have that?
Ooh.
Yes.
That's cool.
And then, of course, they have compound eye, which tons of insects have, right? Big, giant, think of a fly, right? Big, giant compound eyes. And, of course, bees have tongues. They use that for nectar. They have mandibles. This calls it a jaw, but they have the mandibles just like wasps and ants, so they can bite. Some of them are more pronounced than others. But they also have a tongue, so they can slurp up the nectar for energy purposes in their adult form. And I think I've beat this diagram to death.
I just wanted to know about that thing that says pollen press.
Oh yeah, so I have pictures that have the hair and stuff on them. I was going to cover that a little bit later, but
Okay.
the hind legs of most of your bees, they're a lot of hair, right? And bees are hairy in general, and a lot of them will pack pollen in their hind legs for transportation. Yeah. So which one here is the bee, left or right?
Right.
Oh, left.
Right.
Who thinks left? Who thinks right? Okay, so the bee is here. It's on the left. That's a fly.
Look at his eyes.
Yeah, and the one big thing is flies have really big eyes that wrap all the way back, and then the bees, it's kind of hard to tell, this isn't the greatest picture, but their eyes don't go as far back. Those have a red tint, these are more of a black. So this is just to show that there are things out there that are not bees that look like bees. A lot of people think that a lot of flies they see, well, those are actually bees. People go, oh, these gnats. Well, gnats, yes, are flies, but little tiny sweat bees are also really tiny and get in your face. And so people are like, oh, these gnats, and like, no, those are little sweat bees getting all over you. So there's a lot of bee mimics out there, because if you can look like a honeybee, nothing really wants to mess with a honeybee for the most part, because they'll sting you. Helps to deter predators. But yes, this is a fly. That's a bee. Bee, which one's the bee? Left or right?
Left.
Yeah, so that's a yellow jacket, and this is a bee. For the most part, if you want to tell the difference, like I said, flies 2 wings, bees 4. Wasp and bees both have 4 wings, but the wasp very hairless. There are certain bees that are hairless, and they're usually parasitizing bees that don't actually actively gather pollen for their young, because they'll hijack a nest, lay their eggs in something that's already been provisioned. and then they'll go away. But bees, for the most part, they'll have some hair on them. Wasps are very hairless. Bees are very hairy. But the thing is, if you're looking at them, especially under a microscope, bees' faces are generally have some hair on them, and then wasps they're clean shaven. So bees are like me, right? They're all fuzzy on the face, and then wasps are very like Mr. Clean. They're very clean, no hair on the face.
So like, there's one common bald-faced hornet, but all hornets would be bald-faced.
Yeah, I think that has something to do with marking on the face.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. And you'll see that in some bees as well. The males will have a very pronounced yellow spot on the face, and the female won't. That's not true for all of them, but some of them. Some bees will have sexual dimorphism like that, where the males and females look very different in size, different color. They almost look like two different species. But then there's other ones that look very, very similar. The main way to tell the difference between males and females with bees is the number of antennae. I think the males have one more segment and the females have one less. So I think it's males are 13 and females are 12. I could have that reversed, but you got to count them.
Yeah.
You have to be looking at it really
Yeah,
close.
you got to have
Get
a
real
microscope.
chilly.
So yeah, that's bees and wasps. So this is pictures I pulled for Sandruri's Flickr account. There's hundreds of these things. They're all amazing. So this is Osmia. It's on your sheet that if you picked it up at the front there. This is a mason bee. So the houses, if you build one, it's a cavity nester. You might see this guy. It's very easy to identify. Squat, kind of round, very metallic blue, white hairs. This is Megachile. It's a leaf cutter bee. So the mason bees, I'll cover this a little more later, they line their nest with mud, mason, right? Think of a bricklayer or something like that. These guys are leaf cutter bees that cut out little segments of leaves and then line their nest like with the leaves like wallpaper. And this guy's really cool because on the abdomen is really hairy. That's where they store their pollen. They store it on their belly. So they don't have a lot of hair on the back leg here. They store it there on the abdomen, but look, fuzzy face. I mean, they're just covered in hair. This is Lasioglossum. This is the most numerous genus, and these are all genera. They're not species because one, I'm not that good, and two, I could sit here and talk for days and days and days covering all the different species. The Lasioglossum is the most numerous genus. Some of them nest in the ground, some of them nest in cavities. They're very, 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 very small. My collection out there, if you look, they're the smallest bees. They're also the most numerous, and they are also the hardest ones to identify to species. I've been told that they are the bane of bee taxonomy.
But you could sound intelligent just by saying, oh, that looks like a lazy.
Yes, if you can get it to genus, I mean, you're pretty much good to go. You're like from 90% of the people out there, right? But these guys are really hard because they all look very similar, and some species you have to look at the hair between the abdomen and the thorax, how it's distributed. Is it in an even spacing? Is there a little more on the left, a little more on the right? I mean, it gets very super tedious like that, and then if you don't have a good specimen, you don't clean it off very well, or if it gets damaged somehow, you just have to say Lasioglossum species. You can't get it, and these guys, their species are always, taxonomists love to argue.
Are they on this sheet?
I don't think so,
Okay.
because they're just so numerous. I mean, and they're super tiny. They're hard to find unless you're really looking for them on a flower because they're so small. You can find them though. You just have to be patient. And they're the species are always changing with taxonomists, right? They're saying, oh, well, I think it's this species, and then with DNA stuff coming out, it's always getting switched around. So these guys, since they're so numerous, what's a species today can be a different species tomorrow. And so, Lasioglossum, the end. That's all. For me, that's good enough. Bumblebee, right? Yellow, black, hairy abdomen. They are colony nesters like honeybees, except unlike honeybees, their nests don't persist year to year. They will make a nest, it'll flourish for the year, and then the next year it'll be gone because the queens will be born, they'll go off and overwinter, start new nests the next year. And they use pre-existing holes underground like rodent cavities and stuff like that. Ceratina looks like Lasioglossum and Osmia kind of put together. It's metallic-y blue, very, very small. This is the smallest carpenter bee. We're all familiar with the really large carpenter bees, right? These guys are real tiny, like Lasioglossum. I have one in my collection. You can take a look at it. Here you can see the ocelli, really pronounced right there. Lasioglossum and Ceratina look very similar, with the exception of Ceratina has a more rounded abdomen. Lasioglossum has a skinnier abdomen. And if you look real closely, I think it's Lasioglossum has ridges on its abdomen. And
Is there a test at the end?
These guys are more smooth. No, this is just gee whiz information. In case if you want to give what's it called, layman bee taxonomy a shot. I mean, a magnifying glass is enough to do like 90% of this stuff to genus. And then Agapostemon is really a good
That's
one,
beautiful.
except that there's also a genus called Agaporella that looks very similar. They have very similar striping on the abdomen. They're bright green, but this genus has many different looks.
Does he have a common name?
No. They're ground. I'm pretty sure they're ground nesters. But a lot of these things get grouped into like sweat bees, right? Like everyone's like, oh, those are all sweat bees. They're kind of small and they land on you when you're sweaty and try to drink your sweat. But same genus, but you can see very different species. Doesn't have the striped abdomen. Bright metallic green. I've got specimens of these you can take a look at. And if you want to, I actually have a microscope if you guys want to check them out. Bee mimics. This is a flower fly. It looks like a bee, right? Striped abdomen, but notice the big, large red eyes. Only 2 wings. If you look really closely, you see these little sensory nubs. Those used to be wings. Evolutionary time has shrunk them into little sensing organs. That's why a fly can go from flying right side up to upside down onto your ceiling. It's because of these little organs here. These guys are really good to have in your garden. They do a little bit of pollination. They're not actively gathering pollen, but they're on flowers drinking nectar. Their larvae are aphid assassins. So if you have aphids, you want these guys laying eggs everywhere because their larvae will destroy.
Are hoverflies a bee mimic?
I'd have to see
They're
one.
like little teeny, they look like that, but they fly like,
Oh, they hover? Yeah,
Yeah,
those are
fly
bee
out.
mimics, yeah. I think this hoverfly, flowerfly, they're probably the same group. Because these guys will hover as well. And then this is, it looks like a bee eating a bee, but this is actually a robber fly that looks like a bumblebee, and it's a predatory fly. So these guys are good to have in your garden too, because they'll eat bees occasionally, maybe, but they're really they can go after pests, right? So everyone says, oh, I want to have bees in my garden. Well, you also want to have all these other things as well, right? Pollination is great, but if you have a pest outbreak, it kills all your flowers. So you need the predatory stuff and you need the bees. But we'll focus on bees for today. The predatory insects and garden ecology is a whole another topic. So nesting, like I said, you have nesting in the ground, nesting in cavities, and you have nesting behavior that ranges from solitary to fully social and everything in between. You have solitary bees, which means, so let's pretend I'm a bee, and I'm going to make a nest, I'm a female bee. I come out of my nest, I find a male bee, I mate, he dies, because in the insect world, that's all that the males are good for. A short life, but eventful. And the female then usually will go and provision some pollen and nectar for herself to get some energy stores up, start making some eggs. Then I'm going to go find a nice site to make my nest. So if I'm a cavity nesting bee, I'm looking for a pre-existing cavity in a wall or a tree or something. If I'm a ground nesting bee, I'm looking for the right soil. I'm looking for something loose that I can dig into. I'm looking for something with good sun exposure so I can wake up first thing in the morning and go get all of my nectar and pollen, whatever I need. And once I find the right spot, if I'm a ground nesting bee, I'm going to start digging into the ground. And then I'm going to start digging these little cavities, because each of my young are going to have their own room. And because nobody wants their siblings to room together, right? Because it's just a chaotic mess, right? Everybody wants their own room. And so I'm going to make these little cells, and then I'm going to go gather a bunch of pollen. I'm going to make it into a pollen ball called a bee loaf, and I'm going to put it in there, and I'm going to lay an egg on top of it, and then I'm going to seal it up, and then once I'm done, I've laid all my eggs, I'm going to die. And I will never see my young. My young will develop in these cells. The larvae will eat the pollen, they'll pupate, they'll come out as adults, and the cycle starts all over again within a couple of weeks, a couple of months, a year, or a couple of years, depending on the species. If I'm a cavity nesting bee, I do the same exact thing, except I make cells in a row, one after the other, because a cavity is like a hallway, right? It's one direction. So I can also be semi-solitary, which means that I will tolerate other bees of my same species, probably my sisters or whatever, around me, but I'm not going to help them out. I'm going to take care of my nest, you take care of your nest, but I'm not going to impede what you're doing. But then there's also the next level. Hey, we're sisters. You go off and forage. I'll watch your nest for you. And when you come back, you watch my nest, and then I'll go out and forage. And then with cavity nesting bees, it's like, hey, we're sisters. Let's use the same entrance, but let's diverge once we get in there. Or if you're a ground nesting bee, let's use the same entrance, but we'll make our own cells. And we'll cooperate a little bit. And then you go all the way up to things like honeybees. Honeybees and bumblebees are considered eusocial because they have overlapping generations, which means you have aunts and cousins and sisters and everybody all hanging out in the same house, you know, over the course of a year or over the course of many years if it's the case of honeybees. You also have cooperative brood care, which means you're actively taking care of your young. You're not just laying an egg on a piece of pollen or a pollen ball and forgetting about it. You're seeing your babies grow up, if that makes any sense. And then you also have a division of labor. So you have the queen who's laying the eggs, you have the workers who are going out, you have the nursing bees who are taking care of the young. And so you have division of labor all in there. So you have all of these throughout all the bees, all these different versions of sociality. But we're going to focus on ground nesters and cavity nesters because that's the majority of our bees that we're going to see out in nature. Go ahead. So I just covered this, right? You emerge, you mate, you make a nest, you lay your eggs, you close it off, you repeat until you're done, which means you die. So ground nesting bees, they dig underground, they create the cells, they line it with a secretion called from the Dufar gland, and this secretion, they use their tongue like a paintbrush often, and they'll paint the whole inside, and it's a waterproofing secretion. Because you don't want a lot of moisture in your cell, because that leads to fungus, and fungus will kill your babies. They gather pollen, make a bee loaf, they lay the egg on a bee loaf. That's a bee loaf. This is a larvae, so you lay the egg on there, and then the larvae hatches and eats that. That's its food source for it to develop into an adult. And the pollen is usually mixed with nectar or saliva or oil, depending on the species of bee and what kind of flowers it's visiting and all those kinds of things. So ground nesting bees, they can go straight down and make separate cavities like that, or all different kinds of configurations. This depends on the species. They can branch out into single cells like this. They can have hallways with many cells. They can have all kinds of different branches. It can go straight down. It can go out and down and to the sides. And every species keeps their house just a little bit different. And then, like I said, you can have aggregations of these nesters, bee nesting sites. So this is all driven by many factors. So all of these holes here are entrances to different nests. You find these aggregations with ground nesters and with cavity nesters if the right area for nesting is only available in a certain area, like especially in extreme climate, you know, habitats like, let's say, a desert or something like that. This is the only good spot, so we all have to use it, and so we just kind of have to tolerate each other. Or you might be really related, and so then you're going to tolerate each other. Or the environmental conditions are good enough to where we can all share because we're all getting enough. We don't have to.
It's not
really
safety in numbers. I always thought
yes,
safety.
that's another thing. Is there's also safety in numbers. So if I'm a predator or a parasite or something like that, and I'm going to come here and do my thing, as in take resources away from you, if you're an aggregation like this, let's say there's 100 of you, you have a 1 in 100 chance of being parasitized. But if you nest all by yourself and I come along and you're the only one, it goes up to 100%, right?
Wouldn't there also be the flocks of parasites who go, ooh, this is a rich eating ground, we'll all converge on it?
They're usually the parasitoids and parasites and things like that. They're low in numbers. There's not a whole lot of them, and they're very solitary. They don't really go in groups and things like that, just because they're very opportunistic. And so it's like, I'm going to come here and do my thing, and then I only have so many eggs I can lay, and then I'm going to go off and die. And then this aggregation may not exist the next year. Environmental conditions can change, and then there could be no aggregation nearby, or the aggregation moves. So, if it was like this, the same place over and over and over again, yes, you could probably build up a population of parasites that will come back all the time, and then the population numbers will increase and decrease together, and maybe a flux. But this happens kind of sporadically. It's not it's not normal, but it's not unheard of, if that makes sense. Yeah.
What about like rodents and birds? Will they attack?
Well, birds will eat adult bees. And but I don't really know if there's enough nutrition value in something like this for a rodent and stuff to really mess with it. Because you got to think the bee larvae, I mean, they're tiny. They're like this big. I mean, there might be, but
Looks like there's about 100 though.
yeah, I mean, but the thing is like trying to separate this little tiny larvae when you're digging. You know, maybe I don't know.
Because skunks like to eat termites, and then because they're
Yeah.
gonna rip open a log and get a whole bunch
Oh
of
yeah,
termites.
you can get 1,000 termites.
But if they're sticking
log.
they wouldn't want to stick their tongue in a bunch in the sand and try to lick
Yeah.
out that. And they're not designed that way.
Yeah, it's kind of like one of those things. Like, is it worth your time? Might as well just go dig up big fat beetle larvae. You get more bang for your buck. I would imagine this is just too much work. But I mean, I'm not saying it doesn't happen. I don't know.
So cute.
That's a mason bee. You can see it's an emerging one. So the end of this cavity was sealed off with mud, and then it's coming out. But females at night, they'll back into their, whether it's a ground nest or a cavity, they'll back in there with their head out as protection, right? Because if something wants to come get your babies, it's got to go through you first. And then also, these ocelli are on the head. When the sun comes up, that wakes you up. So you can go out and forage, it warms you up. It wakes you up, and then of course you got to get warmed up because bees, they're cold-blooded, cold-blooded. So they got to get warmed up from the sun before they can get out and really start doing anything. But cavity nesters, they're very similar to ground nesters, but they don't make the cavity, they use a pre-existing one. So it's hollow stems, wood-boring beetle holes, so, emerald ash borer, right? Everybody's probably heard of those guys, maybe. But they're these wood-boring beetles that make holes in ash trees, and then they the larvae will girdle the tree, will eat the tissue on the inside, and the tree will die. Well, that tree's gonna be full of holes for bees, so that's one good thing. There's no trash cans in nature. School professor of mine would always say, when one thing gets destroyed, it allows something else to flourish. So, yes, emerald ash borer is really bad for ash trees, but they make pretty good bee habitat, maybe. Something might use it. And then, of course, man-made holes.
An awful lot of bee habitat in Michigan at this point.
Along the Anacostia River, there's a lot of dead ash trees as well. So, yeah, we'll see. I don't know. That'd be an interesting thing to look into to see if bees are utilizing the holes made by them, because they're not round holes; they're like the D shape. So I don't know if that would matter or not. So you have three major categories that are, of course, very loose terms, and you're going to have other stuff. But leaf cutter bees, so the Megachile, like I said, is a little guy who's flying with a leaf to go make a nest with. You have your mason bees, they use mud. And carpenter bees, they chew through your deck, right? They use wood. So that's the big carpenter bee. Has a shiny abdomen, it's very, very large. That's how you can tell the difference between the bumblebee and the carpenter bee. Of course, there's other bees that will use cavities.
And leaf cutters are not a problem, because the master gardeners are always asking about leaf cutters damaging their plants. I said that's a good sign when you see all the little circles.
Well, and there's also other insects that will chew holes in leaves. I mean, you have beetles.
The perfect half moons are the leaf cutters.
Yeah. So yeah, because they'll line their. See, this is a leaf cutter here, lines the nest, and then this is a resin bee, but pretend this is sawdust. That would be a carpenter bee, and then the mason bees. You can see the mud lining the cell. So each of the young, they get their own little room there. And here, right here, you can see fungus
Oh, no.
kill the larvae. So moisture is a big problem, and
So
that's why they line their nest with something to help waterproof it and keep the humidity down.
So those are three different kinds?
Yeah. So this is the leaf cutter's nest. This is a resin, but pretend it's carpenter. I couldn't find a good carpenter one, so pretend this is like sawdust instead of resin. And then you have the mud for the mason bees. So in cross section, that's what it would look like. So bees in nature, what are they doing? Well, they're pollinating your flowers, right? That's good. And of course, they provide food for predatory insects and birds and all kinds of other things. So quick high school lesson on what pollination is, in case we forgot. You have a male part of the plant, the stamen, and then you have the carpel, which is the female part. So the pollen from here needs to get to there, and of course, different flowers have different morphologies, but that's the name of the game. So the bee, since it's actively gathering pollen, is getting pollen all over it because it's super hairy, and when it's crawling over the flower to get the nectar, it's of course, putting pollen on the right part of the flower so that it can create seed and reproduce. And of course, they're picking that pollen up and transporting it to another flower as well. So that way you get cross-pollination. Bees, when they're in flight, actually become statically charged, electrostatically charged, and actually draws the pollen to them. So that's an interesting thing. And then they groom themselves and then pack it into certain parts of their bodies. So if you see a bee that's just totally covered, that means it hasn't like sat down yet and groomed itself and then put it into the hind legs or put it on its abdomen or wherever it's going to carry its pollen back to the nest and create that pollen ball for the young. And then of course this is the bee with totally covered in hair, and then there's the pollen on the back of the leg there. But as you can see, their hair is everywhere. And so these guys are really, really, really made for, you can tell they've co-evolved with flowers. I mean, they're just made for pollination. So bees use sight to locate flowers, and so blue, yellow, and white are the main colors. They don't see the color red, but you will see bees visiting red-colored flowers. True red is what we're talking about, so different, like maybe a maroon or more of a pink, they might be able to see, but a true red, they can't see. But if you see them at a red flower, it's because UV. The bees can see in UV. And so this is a yellow flower, and this is it in UV, false color, but pretend this is a red flower. So it can still see the flower in UV, even though it can't see red. And so bees can sometimes, and other insects as well, they'll find it that way.
Why does it care what color the flower is?
But it doesn't care, it can see certain colors and it can't see certain colors. But if you're catching bees like I used to do, you need to know that, because you put a bunch of red traps out, they're not going to go to it because they're not UV.
Okay.
So I would alternate white and blue and yellow. And they would
We used to
do
do experiments with the high school students that Sam showed us, and we would have red bowls, white bowls, blue bowls, and yellow bowls.
And the red ones they wouldn't go
They
to.
wouldn't catch any.
Yep.
I didn't understand that.
Yeah, they don't see red. And then you have long-tongued and short-tongued bees, and so if you're wanting to do like a pollinator garden, you really have to think about the flowers you're putting in there. It's not rocket science, but long-tongued bees, and it has to do with proportion of the body and everything, but generally speaking, in very loose high school biology terms, long-tongued bees can reach further into a deeper flower, and the short-tongued bees need a shallow flower to reach the nectar. So you want to have both if you want to maximize the bees that you're helping. So bees are eaten by things. That's a praying mantis eating a bee. That's a spider eating a bee. That's a bee caught in a spider web. I think that's an African bee catcher bird. Yeah, bee eater bird. Got one. And there's that robber fly again. I just thought that was really cool looking. And then of course they have mites. These are mites that are all over this bumblebee here. They're a problem. Fungus.
Oh, that's sad.
There's fungus that kills all kinds of different insects. And then you have parasitoid wasps. So this little guy here. And what that guy's doing is laying an egg inside that bee. And then or eggs, most likely. And the larvae will develop inside the bee and eat it from the inside out.
And you actually mean what that girl is doing out that guy? The insect laying the egg is a female.
Yes, that's a female parasitoid wasp. And the larvae will develop inside the bee and then eat it from the inside out. And parasitoid wasps, they do this with all kinds of insects. Parasitoid wasps are very little understood specifically because they're very tiny. They're hard to ID, they're hard to study. But it appears from what I know that they're so widely dispersed that almost every insect group is going to have a specialist. And so pretty much every insect has to worry about being parasitized. Or have a parasitoid attack it, whether in the adult form or in its larval form. Oftentimes, like this in the larval form, caterpillars a lot of times.
We have a hard time in this past couple of years with monarch caterpillars being parasitized, and you don't know until they go into the chrysalis, and then all of a sudden they turn black.
Oh wow!
And so what we've been doing is collecting the monarch caterpillars and putting them in a rearing cage, so that hopefully that will have a better percentage.
Yeah, other caterpillars will, if you pay attention to them in your garden, you'll see like these white things starting to come out of them, and that's the that's the larvae that was inside of them eating them starting to go and pupate. It's really you can look up some pretty
We don't
gnarly
need science
videos
fiction.
online.
There's already
Yeah.
creepy nut stuff out there.
Yeah, it's pretty gnarly. So if you were interested in bee conservation stuff, the best thing that anybody and they can do in their own power would be less mowed grass and more flowering plants. So any standing wood, dead wood is good. Bare loose soil is also good, and of course bee houses, you can put those up as well. So it'd be nice if everybody could go from this to this, but that's not practical for most people because that takes people. Anybody says this is no maintenance is lying. If you want it to be like this, especially in maybe if you're way out in a rural area, sure. But in suburbia, there's so many invasive plants and turf grass seeds and all these other things that can move in, crabgrass. You're going to have to actively manage something like this. Veg, I mean, all of these different things. So if you're out in the rural areas, maybe. But around here, if you want to do it in your backyard, it's going to take some active management. It can be done, but it's probably easier to do something like this. Just a small garden in your yard. A little easier to manage. You can get a ton of diversity in there. Make it look real nice, that way your HOAs and GHI doesn't cite you. You know, nice little border garden. And then you can go a little wild with it, you can do that too. This looks like purple cone flower, bee balm is a really good one. And this plant right here, just me noticing, I've had it in my yard. And
Coreopsis.
yeah, it's tickseed coreopsis. But this variety right here is really easy to find at any nursery, big box store, and it is super drought tolerant, and it takes no care at all. And so it's one of those really plant and forget type things. But I've seen these use it, but I've also seen those flower flies go to it a lot that are really good for aphids. So I would say at least if you got that in your yard and you don't want to touch it, you don't want to bother it, it grows on its own in a nice clump like that. That's probably one of the better plants to go with. Bee balm tends to spread a lot, and coneflower takes a little maintenance. It doesn't like to be dry. But of course, even just one flower can make a big difference. So if you got a pot on a balcony or a porch, and you don't really have a yard, I mean, you can put some flowers in a pots.
I don't think daffodils are
that's
flowering at the moment
That's just an
are out.
example.
Okay.
Flowering
They're
trees and
early.
stuff are-
It's just to show that even one flower can make a difference,
Okay.
right? And then of course you can make bee houses. This is kind of more the style. From the one before and then this one with the holes is the two versions that I've got that we can make. You can get a little more creative and combine the two, or you can go nuts with it and create a giant bee hotel. There's somebody up on Lasser Lane, I think, that has not quite this big, but they have a fairly large red metal circle on a stand, and they have a bunch of different inserts and stuff in there like that. It's really cool looking. And so, I mean, there's all kinds of different ways you can do it. But it's not hard. I mean, more flowers and more nesting habitat equals more bees. And then, of course, the more diversity of flowers that you have with different morphologies and colors and flowering times, and the more different kinds of nesting habitat you have, different size holes, different types of soil, bare soils and stuff, dead wood, you're going to get more bees, more diversified bees. And, of course, you can get really complicated with it, of course, with specialist bees, and then flowering times, you know, if you want to have your really early spring ephemeral bees, they're usually specialists and stuff, and so you got to have the spring ephemerals come out. But that, of course, can be a whole another talk. There's plenty of information on the internet if you want to look that stuff up. But other than that, that's all I have. So I appreciate you all listening.
That was a lot of good stuff.
Yeah.
There's a lot more, I just don't have time for it.
That was really